Welcome to the third installment of our Firefall discussion. When we were discussing the possibility of doing this series, we told the folks at Red 5 that we would only agree to do it if we could talk openly about the game, the good and the bad. And to their credit, they encouraged it. They told us they wanted their community to understand not just the cool stuff they're working on, but also the major challenges they're struggling with as they develop this game. So today, we're going to talk about what might be the biggest selling point for Firefall, but what is also clearly its greatest danger. With Firefall, Red 5 has opted to go with real shooter-first gameplay. Some of you may remember some of the hybrid shooter MMORPGs that have come out before. Games like Tabula Rasa, where, while what you were aiming at sort of mattered, combat was really driven by an underlying set of RPG math. So no matter how good a shooter player you were, it wasn't really going to affect how well you did. Well, those systems never work. They just don't. I don't generally like to make broad, definitive claims like that, but it's almost impossible to make this type of game feel right. If you have a perfect, beautiful headshot lined up, you fire, and you see the little word, miss, pop up over a monster's head, it just feels wrong. It's immensely dissatisfying, and it only serves to completely break whatever immersion the game had managed to establish. So a new system has to be found. The standard answer to this problem, the answer that the Old Republic and many other modern MMOs that use a substantial amount of ranged combat leapt to, was simply to port the purely numerical WoW system to gunplay. While the system may not be satisfying for shooter players, it is a highly functional system. It allows systems designers a lot of levers to balance play, and it constrains combat enough to allow encounter designers to build tight, finely honed, and highly predictable encounters. The answer that Red 5 came to for Firefall, however, was to build true shooter gameplay. To have headshots be headshots. To have combat be fast and frenetic. To let the numbers take a backseat to the shooting in every way. And while that sounds great at first, there's a lot of dangers buried in that system. You see, nobody's really tried a massive open-world shooter before. There's lots of things that come up in an MMO environment that just don't come up in your typical FPS. The first question is, can you manage enough variety of weapons for a much longer-term game than your typical FPS, and still keep the guns feeling good? And on this count, so far the weapons feel great, better than a lot of shooters we've played actually. But we're not even through the beta yet. What happens 6, 8, 12 months down the line? What happens 4 expansions in? But more than that, there's a very distinct reason that no one has tried a massive open-world shooter before. With the multitude of first-person shooters coming to the market today, it's not that no one's thought to bring that to the MMO format before. In fact, you can find a number of massive FPSs that have all the persistence we expect from an MMO. But they tend to be PvP-focused and limit everything to instanced arenas, rather than a truly vast open world where the player can travel between any 2 points. And there's a reason for this. First, interesting FPS AI is hard to build, even in a single-player environment. The difficulty of creating interesting shooter encounters is one of the reasons that you see so many single-player shooters today, limiting the player to very linear paths between set-piece firefights, where the designer knows exactly where the player will enter and where they'll be looking. Putting things in an open world shatters those designer advantages, and on top of that, then you have to figure out how to keep your AI and your encounters engaging, despite the possibility of an uncertain number of players using who knows how many different classes and builds. That is a monumental task, and no matter how much work the people at Red 5 put in, I'm not sure the fights will be able to compete with what most players have come to expect from modern single-player FPSs. I just don't think it's doable. Now hopefully, they'll be able to find some other solution that involves more strategic or more skillful play than you find in your run-of-the-mill corridor shooter these days. And they'll get some mileage out of players getting to choose what challenges they want to tackle, and thus being able to push the limits of what they can do. I'm just not sure how far that goes. They've also got the question of difficulty curve. In an open world environment, how do you make PvE have the right challenge for most of your players, especially at endgame? Say you're a top-notch shooter player. Early on in the game, if things are feeling too easy for you, you can still find an appropriate level of challenge by simply fighting things above your level. But what do you do at endgame? This is actually a problem that many MMOs have, but it's rarely been solved well, and the few cases where it was handled with grace were never in a first-person shooter environment. Lastly, and perhaps most worrisome to me, is the question of exploiting. There's a very odd behavior common amongst MMO players. You'll find that they tend to play in a way that they think is the most efficient, not the most fun. If players think they can get an edge or take advantage of the system by doing something really boring, they'll do it, for hours at a time. It's actually a huge problem in MMO design in general, and unfortunately, it's often reinforced, if not relied upon by poor MMO designers. If you ever had to do a grind quest in an MMO that had you fighting anything but the most interesting monsters you could possibly fight at your level, you've experienced both poor MMO design and the almost irresistible urge to play in the most efficient way possible, rather than the most engaging way possible. Now, building balanced, unexploitable encounters in standard melee-based MMOs is no easy task, but in an environment with range, where combat's much more mobile, I'm not even sure it's possible. Now, they've got some great designers working on the team, like Scott Youngblood, guy who created Tribes. But even with the best designers, you can only solve soluble problems, and I just don't know how you tackle this one in a practical development environment. Remember that in Firefall, you're going to have a jetpack, so you're going to be able to bounce all over the place. The first time someone forgets to perfectly smooth all their geometry, and there's one single triangle sticking out from a cliff face that a player can stand on to shoot enemies without them reaching you or shooting back, all the visceral, exciting combat they've built sort of breaks down. Now, does this mean that Red 5 shouldn't have done this? Not at all. In fact, shooter-first play is probably the only way a smaller company can set themselves apart from the giants like World of Warcraft, and if they can pull it off, it's a risk worth taking. I mean, if they succeed, they'll have brought a whole new genre into the realm of big world MMOs, but man, what a risk. So this is us wishing all of them the best of luck. It makes us nervous. A true shooter MMO is a game we'd love to play, but there's a lot of problems to be solved if we're ever going to see one. Godspeed, team. Catch you next time.